Okay. Yeah, so we are live. Hello everyone, this is Ishan and you are watching Karwaan. And today I am more than honored to host Ambassador Dr. TCA Raghavan with us. He has been on the show very early when we just started with our online sessions on India-Pakistan relations in I think March last year. So you can go and watch that. We'll post a link for that as well. And today Ambassador Raghavan is going to speak about his book, which came out in 2019 called The History Men. And it is on three eminent historians, Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, and Raghubir Singh, and their quest for India's past. A 1982 batch officer of the Indian Foreign Services, Dr. T.C. Raghavan has had an illustrious career as a diplomat. He was the Indian High Commissioner to Singapore till June 2013, after which, till his retirement in 2015, Ambassador Raghavan was the High Commissioner of India at Pakistan. After retirement, he has authored three books. The first is a biography of two Mughal nobles, and the other, a history of India-Pakistan relations, that is called The People Next Door, and third called The Historyman, that we are going to discuss today. In 2018 July, he was appointed as the Director General of the Indian Council for World Affairs. Earlier, Dr. Raghavan was the Deputy High Commissioner in Islamabad from 2003 to 2007, as mentioned. His previous overseas posting include United Kingdom from 95 to 98, Bhutan 92 to 1995, and Kuwait 1983 to 1986. So, without further ado, I welcome and formally invite Ambassador Raghavan to deliver today's Karwan special lecture. And thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation. It is truly an honor to host you.
Thank you very much, Ishan, and very happy to be on the Karwaan platform. Again, I recall our discussion, our lecture, the event you had hosted me to last year, and it seems a very long time ago, but I think it was just before or during the first lockdown. And we are, of course, now in a second lockdown and far worse a situation than we were then. But I'm very happy to see that, notwithstanding all the difficulties which you and your other colleagues must have faced, and you have gone through a personally traumatic time, you have built Karwaan up into a real, a very creative platform, and in the process created, I think, a larger fraternity of those who are interested in history. And you have invited to it some of the most eminent historians of India who have written about specific aspects of Indian history. And frankly, I am somewhat intimidated when I look at your list, because I am not in that league. I am more of an amateur, but I'm still happy to be with you today and to join this fraternity and to talk a little bit about my book, which was also about a fraternity, but a different kind of fraternity, because it was a long time ago. But nevertheless, it was a fraternity of historians. So I'll talk about Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, and Raghubir Singh. And they really spent their entire lives devoted to writing and investigating those aspects of Indian history which interested them. This is what my book was also about, which I had titled History Men. Now, I'm sure all of those present will know about Jadunath Sarkar, but he was a very, very prolific historian. And really the key figure in this fraternity of three historians. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but he was very prolific. But the three most important works that he wrote were a 5-volume history of Aurangzeb, a biography or a history of Shivaji, and finally his magnum opus, The Fall of the Mughal Empire, which was in 4 volumes. But apart from this, he had a very wide canvas of interests, and he wrote any number of magazine and journal articles, and his works in Bangla were also numerous. So he was in every possible way a most prolific scholar. Sarkar, of course, combined this great output of historical works with a life which was full of activity. He was a teacher all his life in Patna, but after he retired from there, was Vice Chancellor of Calcutta University. He was knighted by the colonial state in the late 1920s. He was elected as a member of the American Academy of Historians, and for a very long time, till in fact, Professor Romila Thapar was also elected to that academy, was the only Indian to have been so honored. So he was a very eminent historian in by any possible criteria. Now, G.S. Sardesai was not a teacher. He spent his life working in his working life in Baroda in the service of the Gaikwad, beginning as a tutor to the Gaikwad, to the children in the court, and then moving on to other posts, including as private secretary to the Gaikwad himself. But through that life, he maintained interest in Maratha history, and from the early 1920s, took retirement and devoted himself to writing about the Marathas. Again, he also, of course, composed two original works, Main Currents of Maratha History and his 3-volume New History of the Marathas. But he was best known for bringing out compilations of documents. And he was amongst the first people who was granted access to the records of the Peshwas, which was known as the Peshwa Daftar. And he brought out a 45-volume selection from the Peshwa Daftar. And thereafter, along with Jadunath Sarkar, 15 volumes from the Pune Residency correspondence. In many ways, establishing the chronology, clarifying different minutiae of Maratha history, the credit to a great deal also belongs to G.S. Sardesai. The third in this fraternity is Raghubir Singh. And Raghubir Singh's background is quite different from that of Sardesai or Sarkar. Sarkar was an academic and a teacher. Sardesai was a civil servant who was interested in history and devoted himself to history writing. Raghubir Singh was the son of the Maharaja of Sitamau. Sitamau is a small, not so small, it had a 9-gun salute in British times, but it is a relatively small princely state in Malwa in central India, and he was the Maharaj Kumar, or the heir, and would have become the next ruling prince, but he decided instead to become a historian. Now, he is best known for his work, Malwa in Transition, or A Century of Anarchy, which was his D.Lit dissertation to the University of Agra. The D.Lit was awarded to him in 1935 or 1936. And the connection with Jadunath Sarkar and G.S. Sardesai came about because Sarkar was his guide and his research guide while writing this dissertation. Raghubir Singh composed a number of other works, most of them in Hindi, but he also wrote a significant amount in English. But he is best known for his works on Central India and on Rajput history. He was a conscientious historian, but also was a great institution builder. And because he was so inspired by Sarkar and Sardesai, he decided that he would set up a research library and a research center in Sitamau and converted his palace into a research library, and that remains, it's named after him, the Raghubir Library, and is if you want to study Central Indian history in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, that is a must-go place for the collection which he built up and which has since continued even after his death. So in my book, I have gone into the details of how these three came to form this fraternity, how Sarkar and Sardesai got to know each other, how Raghubir Singh thereafter joined that fraternity. But the story of their friendship is really comes out in the letters they exchanged. Now, Sardesai and Sarkar, even before they met each other, had started corresponding sometime in 1905. And this correspondence continued for about 50 years. Raghubir Singh joined in sometime in the early 30s, and from then till Sarkar and Sardesai died in the late 1950s, this was a triangular correspondence between the three of them. So the friendship or this fraternity, the physical evidence of that is this correspondence, some of which has been published. For instance, selections of letters with Sarkar and Sardesai exchanged from 1905 till about 1957. Selections of that were published in the mid-1950s. Sarkar's letters to Raghubir Singh were kept by Raghubir Singh and were published in 1975. So this really, this correspondence is the bare bones of, which gives the bare bones of the story of this fraternity. But there are other details also, because alongside these three, there was a wider fraternity of historians consisting of other students of Jadunath Sarkar, associates of G.S. Sardesai, and people, scholars, both of whom Sarkar, Sardesai, and Raghubir Singh got to know. And these were well-known historians themselves. K.R. Kanungo, whose works on Sher Shah and Dara Shikoh are still referred to, Hari Ram Gupta, A.L. Srivastav, and the others who I mentioned on the screen. I like to think of this fraternity of friends also as forming something which we would today call an epistemic community, because it was really a fraternity based on sharing knowledge and supporting the advancement of historical knowledge in the very early stages of serious history writing in India. As I said, Sarkar was at the center of this fraternity. He was very clearly the dominant personality. He was also the one who was best known publicly, because even in his own time, he was regarded as being India's greatest living historian because of the vast range of his works and the fact that he had been such a dedicated and brilliant teacher and research guide. This is a photograph of Sarkar on the left, G.S. Sardesai on the extreme right, with K.M. Munshi and Leelavati Munshi. In my book, I made a mistake and did not correctly identify K.M. Munshi, but thereafter a number of scholars and others wrote to me that this was an error, and I hope I have the opportunity of correcting it on some occasion. This is also a photograph of Sarkar and Sardesai. This was a famous meeting held in 1938 in Sardesai's house in a village called Kamshet. And this was really a function which was organized by his students and friends and associates, but it took the form of a historical seminar. Dipesh Chakrabarti, in his book on Sarkar and Sardesai, referred to it as being India's first historical conference. And it was a wonderful occasion where a number of historians of the time had got together and spent 2 days discussing different aspects of Indian history. This is a photograph of Jadunath Sarkar visiting Raghubir Singh in Sitamau when he agreed to become Raghubir Singh's research guide. This is a photograph taken in Calcutta when Raghubir Singh had visited there shortly after he was awarded the D.Litt thesis. And let me begin what I wanted to say today by talking a little bit about how I got interested in these three scholars in this fraternity. I had read the Jadunath Sarkar G.S. Sardesai printed correspondence, the selections which were printed sometime in the early 70s when I was an undergraduate in Delhi University, and liked the interest they took on really obscure aspects of Indian history, Mughal and Maratha history. But when you go through the correspondence, it also tells you about an age which has gone, in which scholars depended primarily on post, that means what we call snail mail, and the railway timetable to maintain contacts with each other. But the correspondence is really a vast resource into very, very specific and detailed aspects of chronology, place names, trade routes, routes which armies on the march took, and so on. And so I was interested in it, but it was more of a pastime. Around the same time, in 75 or 76, I read Sardesai's letters to Raghubir Singh, which had also been printed in 1975. More or less a complete set was printed. And that too was also interesting for, again, giving an insight into how history was written 40 or 50 years ago and the difficulties historians faced. And then I more or less had forgotten about it till in 2002, when I was interested in finding out a little more about Abdur Rahim Khan Khanan. I discovered that Abdur Rahim Khan Khanan's, one of his early modern biographers was a Rajasthani historian, Munshi Devi Prasad. And a great number of Munshi Devi Prasad's works were kept in a library in Sitamau, which is how I visited the Raghubir Singh Library, which is this old, small little palace which was converted into a research library. This is the original structure. Since 2002, a number of other buildings have been added to the left. A large conference hall has been constructed. There are more modern facilities now. But this is how as I first saw it. And in the Raghubir Singh library, it is a historian's delight, because this is a library which was a collection which was built up by Raghubir Singh from scratch. And he began by collecting documents from Sitamau itself, from the different thikanas or the different major landholders of Sitamau, and thereafter branched out into other parts of Malwa, into Rajasthan, picking up correspondence between important manuscripts from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. But there are also household accounts, there are horoscopes. He bought virtually everything published on Indian history from the 1930s onwards, and Sarkar and Sardesai were his guides in telling him what to buy. He also had the resources to build up a library of this kind. In those days, any historian working on a subject had to be, to a great extent, self-sufficient, or Atmanirbhar, as we would call it today. You had to have your own research library. Sarkar's library is now in the National Library in Calcutta. Unfortunately, it has been dispersed. It's not kept together, which is something which should be remedied in the future. But it's a vast collection, and Sarkar built it up by buying books from civil servants and others, British civil servants and others who were leaving India on retirement. He was also helped by a number of British scholars who were in India as civil servants, and they guided him on how to purchase manuscripts from auctioneers in the UK, etc., etc. So that collection is in the National Library. Sardesai's own collection is fortunately kept together and is in the Deccan College Library in Pune, but it's rarely visited. But the greatest of the three libraries, because Raghubir Singh also made it a point to get copies made of whatever manuscripts or books Sardesai and Sarkar had acquired, is in Sitamau. And as I said, if you want to study Central India in the 18th century, Sitamau is the place to go to. And it is an eclectic collection, but it's an indispensable collection. Unfortunately, I was able to find papers relating to Munshi Devi Prasad, and that helped me write my book on Abdul Rahim Khane Khanan and Behram Khan. But in the time I spent there, I also got a sense of this fraternity, of this friendship, and how this fraternity played such a great role in the writing of Indian history in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 1950s, because there are much of the correspondence between Raghubir Singh and Sardesai is kept there. There are many other documents which have not been, letters between the three which have not been published, which are maintained there. But more than anything else, you get a sense of each of these three historians and the commitment they brought to bear to their discipline by spending some time in the Raghubir Library in Sitamau. Now about the correspondence itself, let me begin with the last letter which Jadunath Sarkar wrote to Sardesai, and this was in May 1958 on the occasion of G.S. Sardesai's 94th birthday. Sarkar was convinced that Sardesai was dying, and he wrote this letter with that in mind. But it so happened that Sarkar himself died a few days later, and Sardesai outlived him by a few months. It's a beautiful letter. It's a quote from Tennyson, and it's unusual because you rarely come across grown men having this kind of strong friendship over such a long period of time, and that friendship being maintained and sustained by letter writing, because as they grew older, their physical meetings were rarer. Even when they were alive, they realized that the letters which they had written to each other comprised a valuable source of Indian history writing. I hope this is visible, the screen. So,
Yes.
Even while they were alive, they were in touch with each other about what should we do with this correspondence, because it really tells you something about the evolution of Indian history writing and Indian historiography. But the bulk of the correspondence really is concerned with, as I said, very, very specific details, place names, dates. Is a particular document authentic or is it a forgery? But there are also a great deal of debate about the differing approaches of each of these three to history writing, or about understanding what they were writing about. Rarer, but occasionally you find certain references to contemporary developments, and then each would try to relate it to what had happened in the past. So for instance, you have this very interesting letter in 1921, and the backdrop to it, of course, is the Khilafat movement in India, which was a political agitation led by Mahatma Gandhi over the abolition of the Khilafat in Turkey. Often the letters would be about new sources or new manuscripts which they had come across or discovered. So you have this very excited letter from Jadunath Sarkar to Raghubir Singh in 1946, saying that he had come across certain letters which the Jaipur Maharajas were writing to Ahmad Shah Abdali, and how this was to be kept confidential because the Jaipur state would try to otherwise suppress them, because they would have regarded it as a blemish on their clan history that one of their ancestors had been in correspondence with quote unquote an invader. There are also the letters also have practical advice. For instance, Sarkar's letters to Singh are really those of a teacher to his student, and it's full of constant advice, suggestions, admonishment, and this is a wonderful letter about how books are to be maintained and how the library is to be kept well aired, etc. So this was a fraternity, and it was a supportive fraternity because they helped each other in numerous ways, in sending books to each other, in having manuscripts copied, in hunting out sources. This was an age when all the aids for historical research which we take for granted today did not exist. So your networks and fraternities were the key multiplier or force multiplier you had. So this was a very strong fraternity. But the interesting thing is that this fraternity was not made up of entirely like-minded people. Sarkar's view of the Mughals and the Marathas and the Rajputs was quite different from Sardesai's view. And similarly, Raghubir Singh's own view of the Marathas and the Mughals and of the Rajputs was markedly different from that of Sardesai and Sarkar. So it was a strong fraternity, but that does not mean that this was a fraternity of groupthink, by no means. Now, Sarkar, as I said, is the dominant force in this fraternity, but also in that wider epistemic community. He was a very hardworking person. His life had, as I said, an inbuilt economy to it. What we would today call the old-fashioned air, that don't waste time, work hard, keep a track of what you have been doing so that you can improve it from one day to the next. He was obviously a very hardworking individual, and one of his students, Kanungo, has left this account of what would be the aftermath of a feverish pace of activity when he would be writing or trying to complete one chapter before it was sent to the press. Again, these are more quotes about how very hard he would work. He was notoriously antisocial because he saw socializing as a waste of time. And any number of people have commented on this, that if someone came to see him, he would say, you have 30 seconds or you have 1 minute or 2 minutes. And he just couldn't stand time being wasted. But really, Sarkar is important, and he was important in his own time because of the quality of the history he wrote. And much of what he has written is, of course, dated because it has been overtaken by new sources, new interpretations, new methodologies. But nevertheless, he was a writer who believed that the task of the historians was to evoke the past. And an evocation of the past meant that you had to bring out its drama, its achievement, and ultimately its tragedy. So he was a writer of great dramatic force, and he thought that it is my duty to animate what I am writing. So animation meant that every place had to have the character which assigned to it, which had existed in the past. And you find he went to enormous trouble to locate places, find out what happened over there, and what was that place like when that event took place. Now, one of my favorite descriptions is in Fall of the Mughal Empire, I think volume 2 or volume 3, which is about a place called Ghausgar. Now, Ghausgar is really obscure, totally forgotten. But in Sarkar's book, it has a certain value which you decipher by seeing why does he devote 3 or 4 pages talking about the physical environments of Ghausgar. What did that village or little town or kasbah contain at that time? Now, Ghausgar, as it happened, was one of the important centers of Najib-ud-Dawla, and where his son had a small fort. And one of the last campaigns of the Mughals was against Ghausgar, and Ghausgar was sacked. And his Najib-ud-Dawla's grandson Ghulam Qadir saw the sack of this citadel as something which had to be revenged, and the revenge finally came in 1788 when the Mughals were taken captive by Ghulam Qadir, and the harem was raped, and so on and so on. It was a traumatic event in the history of the Mughals, and in Sarkar's work, that particular event and the background, which is the sack of Ghausgar and Ghausgar itself, really evokes that time and the events of that time in a wonderful way. If you read, for instance, Muzaffar Alam, The Passing of Empire in North India, Ghausgar figures in the index, but there's a tangential reference to it as a place associated with Ghulam Qadir and Najib-ud-Dawla, etc. There's nothing else about Ghausgar, because if you take a wider modern view of history writing, the place itself doesn't have that same significance as it had to someone like Sarkar, because who saw his duty, as I said, being to evoke the past so that you interest the reader in the drama of a particular event, and not just in the explanation of that event. One can go on talking about Sarkar endlessly, so I'll be somewhat quick on this. But Sarkar, similarly, along with places, was fascinated by individuals. And if you read his books, you find certain individuals. They are, of course, mega individuals, Aurangzeb, Shivaji, but there are also others who were of great interest to Sarkar: Mir Jumla, Jai Singh, Durgadas Rathod, Kushal Khan Khatak, the Scindias, especially Bahaji Scindia. Now, each of them, many of his students then went on to write full-fledged biographies but in Sarkar's works themselves, you find this great importance to fleshing out the individual in every possible way. So you have places, you have individuals, and finally you have events. And the events itself, Sarkar felt that the role of the historian is to go deep into the particular event. So two events in particular which fascinated him greatly, and from which in writing the history of which he felt he had done a creditable job. One was the visit of Shivaji to Agra and what happened in the court. And Sarkar's explanation is a fascinating one, at least to me, because he shows how small slip-ups, what we would today call protocol mix-ups, really ruined a great summit which Jai Singh in Burhanpur had planned and spent months planning every possible detail. But in the end, small protocol mix-ups rather than any grand ideological difference. But it's these small protocol slip-ups which started a downhill slide and ended in that summit between Aurangzeb and Shivaji, ending in disaster. And if it had gone well, or if it had had a different ending, that question remains as one of those great counterfactuals of Indian history. And there are many other events of this kind which fascinated Sarkar. And as I said, he believed his duty as a historian was to evoke the past and not simply write it, or write it to evoke the past. This is a description of Delhi towards the end of the Mughals. But really, if you dip into his works, you will find these fascinating. But let me come to this question of Aurangzeb and Sarkar. Why did Sarkar choose Aurangzeb as a subject of study, and then spend almost a decade and a half writing this 5-volume history of Aurangzeb? And I think Sarkar is both a great admirer of Aurangzeb, of his energy, his discipline, the seriousness which he brought to his role as the emperor, but is also appalled at his bigotry, and how that religious orthodoxy contributed to the final downfall of the Mughals. So this mixture of opposites in Aurangzeb is what attracted Sarkar. And in 1919, volume 4 of Aurangzeb came out alongside History of Shivaji, which was because while researching Aurangzeb, Sarkar naturally got interested in Shivaji and then wrote a book about Shivaji. And both this volume 4 and History of Shivaji came out in 1919. And many have called 1919 a seminal year of Indian history writing, because after 2.5 centuries, you had these two old rivals and contestants, Aurangzeb and Shivaji, facing each other on Jadunath Sarkar's bookshelf with two separate works. Sarkar's work on Aurangzeb was enormously controversial, almost from the time it was printed, but so was his work on Shivaji. While many saw Sarkar's work on Aurangzeb as being retrograde and a regression, because the spirit of the time, the final years of the second decade of the 20th century, were the years after the Lucknow Pact. Everyone thought that Hindu-Muslim unity was something which had to be worked towards, it had to be preserved. And this work on Aurangzeb to that extent was seen as a discordant note, and it was very controversial, and many criticized it. It was, of course, in the mainstream seen as a great formative work of Indian history writing. So you have the controversial parts of Aurangzeb were his descriptions of the Mughal state, in terms of what Aurangzeb converted it into, and conversions, temple destructions, etc., etc. But his work on Shivaji was equally controversial, because the fact is that Sarkar believed that while you have to be reverential to the facts of history, you don't have to be reverential about the past. And the historian has to expose the past for whatever it might contain. So you have major differences, for instance, between Sardesai and Sarkar over Sarkar's Shivaji and his times, because people in Maharashtra who read the book were appalled at the lack of reverence with which Sarkar approached Shivaji, to the extent that he did not add G to Shiva and just called him Shiva, much in the way the Mughal documents used to refer to Shivaji as. But more than that, they objected to his discussions about the nature of the Maratha state itself. And so Sarkar, by raising questions that was it no more than a state which lives on aggression and plunder, was really committing some kind of blasphemy, as far as many Maratha scholars and historians, and especially those who felt that the Marathas were really the instrument by which nationalism in Maharashtra could be consolidated. So they were appalled at Sarkar's treatment. And this, as I said, led to major differences between Sarkar and Sardesai. Sarkar's next great set of works was his 4-volume Decline of the Mughals. And this really, the end of the Mughals, the fall of the Mughal Empire, is really written as the end of the British Empire in India is also becoming more and more evident. And Sarkar wrote the fall of the Mughals as a tragedy. I mean, he was greatly influenced by Gibbons while writing it, but he saw it as a tragedy of multiple dimensions. And it's interesting when you read Sarkar about the later Mughals, the second half of the 18th century and the early 19th century, and compare it with another perspective on North India in that period, which you find in the historical novels of Samshur Rahman, of the late Samshur Rahman Farooqi. And what a contrast there is between the two. Samshur Rahman Farooqi sees the late 18th, early 19th centuries as a period of refinement, of wit, of great scholarly polish and achievement, of great sophistication, while Sarkar sees it as a period of decadence and decline. And that decadence and decline is not just in military or political terms, but also in spiritual and terms of moral integrity, where a ruling elite has lost the power or the will to govern. Now, these two contrasting frames of seeing the late 18th, early 19th century is really a very useful way for non-specialist historians to look at one particular period of our history. Now, Sarkar's legacy is deeply contested. Peter Hardy once wrote about him as being a camp follower of the British. He accuses him of the gravest of crimes a historian can commit, which is that of being anachronistic, that he was writing history in terms of his own values, rather than seeing the past as it had existed in its own terms. Another great historian of our times, the late D.N. Jha, had called Sarkar the high priest of communal historiography in India. Now, whether this judgment needs to be tempered by a rereading of Sarkar, I will leave to other readers of Sarkar. And I have given my own views in my book. But let me turn now to Sardesai. So Sardesai, in contrast to Sarkar's very clinical detachment while writing about the past, has a more reverential view of Maratha history. And you can see the Sarkar-Sardesai relationship, and this is something which comes across in virtually almost every single letter they exchange. You can see their relationship as this contest between Sarkar pushing Sardesai to be clinical, to be objective, to not look for the most favorable view possible of the Marathas, but be more objective and detached. While Sardesai himself is, a part of him is enamored of the political achievement of the Marathas, and he can't help but being reverential. So this contest is going on constantly between the two, and it explains to a very great extent their differences about so many things with regard to the Maratha-Mughal interface, the Maratha-Rajput interface, and finally specific aspects of Maratha history itself. And these differences flowed on to how to evaluate source materials, what was a forgery. Sardesai often said that this technically may be a forgery, but it still gives a spirit of that particular age. And Sarkar's view was a more cut and dry one, that if something is a forgery, then you can't accept any part of it. It's like a witness giving evidence in a court of law, that if part of the witness's testimony is proved to be false, then the witness himself or herself is degraded as a whole. So you have to be much more clinical about your sources. So much of their differences really arose from this different view of the Marathas and the role of the Marathas in Indian history. Sardesai, of course, got access to the Peshwa Daftar primarily because of Sarkar's great influence in the civil service, in the government, and in the history writing establishment. When he got that access to the Peshwa Daftar, there was a storm in Peshawar, in Maharashtra, because there had been scholars of Maratha history who had been trying for access for 20, 30 years, but had been denied it by the British government. And finally, when it was decided to open it up, they felt that this person, who was not really a historian, he was really a tutor, and he believed in simplifying history, writing it for children, etc., had been given access because of the influence of this Calcutta historian who had great influence with the government. But Sarkar certainly helped Sardesai a great deal, and possibly understood better than anyone else the very great struggle which Sardesai went through when he brought out his 45 volumes of selections from the Peshwa Daftar. When we complain about archives today and access to archives today and the difficulties of working in archives in India today, it's useful to look back at that earlier period, in the first generation of scholars who used archives, government archives, and the difficulties and the problems they faced. We come now to Raghubir Singh, and Raghubir Singh, Maharaj Kumar of Sitamau. Now, Sitamau is a small Rathore principality state now in Madhya Pradesh, in Malwa, but it is along with Ratlam and one or two other Rathore states nearby. These are Rathore islands surrounded by larger Maratha kingdoms. So the neighboring state, the largest state neighboring Sitamau, was Indore, the Holkar kingdom. And the Maratha Rajput interface really defined Raghubir Singh's entire inheritance. and view of history. So his perspective on the Marathas was quite different from that of Sardesai or even of Sarkar, because both Sardesai and Sarkar to some extent saw the rise of the Marathas as a reaction to the religious intolerance of the Mughal Empire in Aurangzeb's time, and as to how that led to a reaction, a Hindu reaction, and thereafter the rise of a military and political resistance movement. For Raghubir Singh, this view was not a correct. He saw the Marathas as a destabilizing force, as he called them, a foreign element who had nothing to do with Malwa. They were there only for loot and for plunder, and they were upsetting and disrupting a traditional and well-established way of life in which the Mughals and the Rajputs had reached a very strong modus vivendi and a cooperative interface between the two. So as I said, this was the fraternity between these three historians is a very strong fraternity, but it is a fraternity of individuals who don't agree on most aspects or many aspects of what they were writing about. There was no groupthink involved in this fraternity. It was not an echo chamber. So for Raghubir, for Sardesai the expansion of the Marathas to the north had been a liberation for the populations of the north, and especially of Malwa. His theory was that when the Marathas started expanding to the north, they were welcomed as liberators and saviors. Sarkar's position was not identical to Sardesai, but was similar. He said, yes, Aurangzeb's policies had alienated the Rajputs and had weakened the Mughal empire and its alliances which it had built up with the Rajputs and others. Raghubir Singh's view was different. His view was that the Maratha incursion into Malwa was fiercely resisted by the indigenous populations and especially by the Rajputs. The Mughal-Rajput alliance remained strong, notwithstanding Aurangzeb's policies. And really, if the Marathas succeeded in their expansion to the north, it was not because they were welcomed or because they were seen as liberators, but it was because they were the stronger military force, and the Mughals and the Rajputs succumbed to the Maratha armies. So these are different views of history, and really this brings me to the last part of my talk today. I haven't gone into all the details about their lives, their friendships, the different aspects which concern them so much. But I want to end with this point about different views of history, because this is a debate which takes place with great intensity in our times too. And I think a useful insight into our times would be to see the debates amongst very thoughtful historians in the late 1930s and 1940s. Now, in this debate, one particular view was taken by R.C. Majumdar, and you find this view reflected in his presidential address to the Indian History Congress in 1939. And essentially what he's saying is that how should we write about the less savory aspects of our past? And he was objecting to a trend which he possibly had found evident, and which he later in his life, Majumdar, this is well known, thought that this trend was becoming dominant, was that you're airbrushing away certain controversial aspects of our history because they are divisive. And his address to the Indian History Congress in 1939 really sums up that view that we have to take a holistic view of our past, and we should not be afraid of addressing issues only because they are divisive. And this view was stated by him in 1939. You have a contrarian perspective to this, which was in 1947. Which was in 1947 when another distinguished historian, Muhammad Habib, gave a presidential address to the Indian History Congress just a few months after the trauma which he experienced personally, and many others like him also experienced just a few months after the trauma of partition. Muhammad Habib's family himself, as we know, was divided. One part went to Pakistan, the other part stayed behind. He was a professor of history in Aligarh Muslim University. Aligarh itself, as is well known, was one of the main intellectual centers for the ideology of Pakistan. And in 1947, Muhammad Habib also addressed the same question which R.C. Majumdar had raised. How do we address those aspects of our history which are divisive? I'll skip the rest of Majumdar's extracts. And Muhammad Habib in December 1947. So he talks about decolonization as a world historic achievement. He was, of course, as you all know, Marxist in his thinking and also in his terminology. But the central question he was asking was the same one, that how do we address aspects of our history which could potentially be divisive at the present juncture. And his response, of course, both would agree that history has to be guided by the facts, and it cannot be fanciful, and it cannot be based on anything other than facts. But nevertheless, there is a difference of emphasis. And I think this difference of emphasis is something which historians need to engage with all the time. And in many ways, the debates we confront today are similar to the debates of the 1940s. There are, of course, differences, but nevertheless, the similarities are quite striking. And this Muhammad Habib, R.C. Majumdar dualism is possibly one way to begin that engagement. As far as I know, and this is, I think, the unfortunate part of Indian historiography, I don't think these two historians themselves engaged with each other. And possibly it would have been better if they had. We have no record of Jadunath Sarkar and Muhammad Habib ever engaging. One could say that Sarkar was writing about the 17th and 18th century. Muhammad Habib's interest in medieval India was of a much earlier period, so the points of contact were fewer. But nevertheless, I think by this absence of engagement between these two perspectives has left a certain fragility to Indian history, and it is historians of the present who have to address that fragility and try to see that as historians, they find the best possible way forward from it. Now, the Habib address is one of the important documents of Indian history and Indian historiography, and both in its critique of the way the British wrote about medieval India, how how that particular perspective acquired a life of its own, but also on other aspects of what I said. How do we address the contested aspects of Indian history writing? Now, both Sardesai and Raghubir Singh also contributed to this debate. Sardesai delivered the presidential address in 1949 or 1950. Raghubir Singh did so, presidential section to the medieval Indian history section in 1951, 52. And they both went into in quite a great deal of detail about how do historians address the partition as historians. And really that debate, as I said, is something which we should engage with, given the polarizations in our own time. And I'll close with this final slide about how Sarkar would have addressed this issue. And he was impatient of this entire debate. We know that he never had any time for the Indian History Congress, and he saw it as a waste of time and as a talk shop. But really, in his view, and this is a wonderful phrase when he says the true scholar is a national of the Republic of Letters. And he had earlier said that I don't care whether truth is or not a blow to the glory of my country, but I have to be devoted to it. So I'll close there. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I do hope some of you read my book, which is, as I said at the beginning, I'm an amateur. I'm not a professional academic historian, but I do think a wider fraternity should engage with all aspects of Indian history. And I'm very happy that Karwaan has contributed so much to that wider engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raghavan, for such an interesting lecture on three great scholars of Indian history. And we have many questions for you in the chat, and I'll be reading those out for you. The first question is by Suraj Kumar. His question is, he's interested in learning about the Abdali Naga Sadhu relationship. What did Sarkar and Sardesai have to say about it in their correspondence?
Abdali whom?
Abdali and Naga Sadhus.
Oh, Abdali and the Nagas. Yes, the Nagas fascinated Sarkar and Sardesai a great deal. And at one stage, Sarkar accepted a commission. He took an advance of money to write a history of one particular sect of the Nagas. And then as he was doing so, he realized the difficulties of fulfilling this commission because the actual historical record was showing the Nagas to have been largely a mercenary force and who acted on behalf of different rulers and different and took part in joined different armies in quite an arbitrary and way. So he then tried to find a way out, but he finally did write it, but he wrote only one part of it and left the rest of it to be written by someone else. The details are in my book. But he was not particularly surprised about the Nagas and the fact that they formed a contingent in Ahmad Shah Abdali's army, because he saw the close connection between the Nagas and the rulers of Awadh, and the fact that since Awadh had joined in with Ahmad Shah Abdali, this would necessarily have to follow. What Ahmad Shah Abdali thought of these Nagas is, of course, quite an amusing part of the whole story, because Ahmad Shah Abdali was appalled when he saw these people who were naked, and it offended his sense of decorum of what a military contingent should look like. And Sarkar went into that in great detail in his Fall of the Mughal Empire, because he devotes a great deal of space to Panipat and does go into the questions as to why the Nagas ended up on the side of the Afghans in the Battle of Panipat.
The next question is from this is from Arjun Abhishek Roy. His question is Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, and Raghubir Singh, all three belonged at a time when Indian history was written and interpreted through colonial eye. As Professor Thapar says that British historians divided Indian history into two, Hindu and Islamic histories, these three historians worked at a time when national identity was in formation. Did this trio try to unfold the history of India from colonial spring and gave Indian history an identity of its own?
Well, I think they certainly gave Indian history an identity of its own. Whether they saw it as untying the colonial strings, I don't know. Sarkar was a great admirer of British rule in India. He was knighted by the colonial state. He took great pride in that honor and added Sir to his name as long as he could, and certainly till August 1947. So he's someone, he was very admiring of British civil servants. He was very admiring of the British military approach, which led to the conquest of India. He saw Indian rulers as failing abysmally in applying knowledge to politics and to military matters. So he was very much of a product of colonial India and English education in that sense. To perhaps some extent, Sardesai was the same, except that Sardesai was not as enthusiastic. He had a more regional approach to the British, who were seen as the power which had defeated the Marathas, and he had spent most of his life one step away from the empire because he was in Baroda, which was a princely state. Raghubir Singh was, of course, the son of the heir of a ruling Maharaja, but he was a younger man. He saw very clearly the end of empire, and really he did see, if of the three, he more than anyone else did see the need for India to think beyond the British connection in political terms, in administrative terms, in constitutional terms, but also in terms of history writing. And one of the decisions which Raghubir Singh took soon after 1947 was that he said, I would henceforth only write in English. When he went to give the presidential address to the 1950 or 1951 session of the Indian History Congress in Gwalior, he said, no, I'm going to speak in Hindi. And there was an uproar because they said, no, you can't speak in Hindi. The language which we use in the Indian History Congress is English. So he said, no, but I have decided I'm only going to speak in Hindi. So he did see the need for moving beyond categories which had been framed by the British in writing Indian history, perhaps more so than Sarkar and Sardesai. But the point is that Sarkar and Sardesai were writing history in an age which is quite different from ours, or even different from the time when Dr. Thapar was writing her principal works in the 1960s and 70s. It was a formative age when Sardesai and Sarkar were composing their works, and they saw their task as establishing the chronology, using the widest possible range of sources, making sure sources were available to historians, and certainly in the process of doing that, they were going to move beyond the histories which British colonial civil servants had written. But they saw their task in much more, in terms different from what we would see it today. So my personal view is to apply the criteria of how determined by colonial conditions was their history writing is in some ways stating the obvious. Yes, they were products of the colonial state. So it was bound to be influenced by those particular conditions. So, but I think we need to ask the next question. Yes, after having replied in the positive to the first question, what were their achievements, notwithstanding that positive answer? I think that is really the question to ask about Sarkar and Sardesai.
The next question is from Sukhdev Sohal ji. His question is how the word of Jadunath Sarkar and Sardesai and Raghubir Singh collapsed in the 1950s amidst changing political and historical thinking in independent India, where there was a shift in Indian historical writing.
Well, if you read Dipesh Chakravarti's book, in his view, he says it, that his life was a minor tragedy. Because firstly, someone like Sardesai could not come around totally to Sarkar's view of writing history scientifically and objectively, and was always swayed by more nativistic approaches towards the Marathas, but also because a new history establishment supplanted them. Now, my view is slightly different. I mean, if you look at the number of Jadunath Sarkar's books which are still in print, it's quite astonishing. The Fall of the Mughal Empire is constantly being brought out by Orient Black Swan in new editions. The 5-volume Shivaji may be out of print, but a 1-volume condensation of that, which Sarkar had done himself, is still available for those who look for it. His shorter essays remain in print in different collections. So this is by no means the end of a tradition of history writing. Yes, new schools of history writing arose, but that is not necessarily the end of an older tradition. To some extent, this view that Sarkar's view, or people like Sarkar, R.C. Majumdar, etc., they were suppressed by a new history writing establishment. To some extent, that view is not entirely correct. Because it is in the nature of history writing that views change, perspectives change, new streams and new approaches emerge without anything being suppressed. But I do think that this debate, which took place in the 1940s, and some evidence of that you find in the Majumdar Muhammad Habib duality, I think we stopped engaging with that debate with the intensity with which we should have done.
The next question is again from Sukhdev Sohal, and his question is differences among these historians are interesting, yet commonality of their views require response. Is it their attitude towards the Muslims in the communally charged atmosphere of India in the post-1920s?
Well, they had many commonalities of views, and certain commonalities was, the most fundamental point of convergence between the three was how history was to be written. And to put it very simply, if you were writing about something, you had to go and visit the place. Sarkar never wrote about a battle without visiting that battlefield. And similarly with Raghubir Singh and Sardesai. Secondly, you had to unearth every possible source to flesh out the details of that period and the details of the episode and the details of that age. So using as vast a variety of sources as possible. And thirdly, and most importantly, I think their approach was that it's not simply enough to write history by offering another opinion. Writing history meant that you had to find new sources. And I think the search for new sources is really what drove all three of them. because they would have seen a different interpretation, not as an original work of history. So much of what we write, they would have said, oh, this is not, where are your original sources? And so it would have meant, it's, but that was their view. So these are the similarities which I think bound them together. There are differences, of course. One was this view about the Marathas, the Mughals, the Rajputs, and ultimately about the nature of indigenous state forms in the 18th century and why, and this was really the question which they all asked at different points of time, why did the British triumph? What were the weaknesses of Indian society and Indian polity? So I think those questions they were all interested in, but they had different answers. I think that the communal atmosphere actually, to be fair to Sarkar, I think it affected him less than what people have said, because he saw it necessary to exclude every possible contemporary influence when history is to be written. So for instance, his work on Aurangzeb was very controversial because it went into temple destruction, the nature of the Mughal state, the contrast with earlier emperors, Aurangzeb's own personal bigotry and orthodoxy, and the erosion this led to in the character of the Mughals. I think these views were all controversial. And then, as now, now not in India so much, but certainly in Pakistan, Aurangzeb has many admirers. For them, Sarkar's work was one-sided and heresy, and just took what British historians had written about Aurangzeb as being the truth. But Sarkar had seen many of the sources himself. I don't think it's fair to say that he was totally influenced or unduly influenced by the English histories of Aurangzeb. He had a mind of his own, because much the same approach you find in his history of Shivaji. And the reasons which made Aurangzeb controversial, you find his history of Shivaji being controversial for precisely the same reasons. So I think the communally charged atmosphere affected him less, certainly till the early 40s. I think perhaps from 1945 onwards, this changed. His son was killed during the great Calcutta killings of 1945. His personal life was shattered after that. And possibly in his last years, there was a certain element of bitterness which crept him. But if you look at the bulk of his life, I think he excluded a great many contemporary influences to a greater extent than to which he is given credit.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Raghavan, for taking out time for doing this lecture, for answering all the questions that we have on Facebook live chat. Somebody's asking for if they can connect with you on email.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so we'll write his email in the chat box, so you can check that out and mail him, and maybe you can connect with him on email. So thank you so much, sir. And there's an announcement for everybody. I think you must have read about the Central Vista project that has been pursued by the Prime Minister and his government, our government, and three major buildings that concerns every history student are planned to demolish, and that are the National Archives, the National Museum, and the IGNCA, which is a very social space. And I have fond memories of attending Jashne and other Jashne Adab and other events there. So we have started this hashtag called hashtag Save the Central Vista, where you can use it on Twitter to share your memories of those places, of your evening strolls at Rajpath, or sitting near the jamun trees of Rajpath, which are not there now after the demolition there, and maybe your trips to the National Archives, the national museums, to to make an awareness of this, of the dangers of this plan. And there are certain questions that all history students are asking, that is transparency of where those precious collections of the National Archives and national museums that are going to be kept, and not just for a year, but as the minister says, for at least 3 years, that is when that will be rebuilt somewhere else. So use that hashtag is hashtag save the central vista. So on Twitter, on Facebook, we would love to see some good memories of those buildings, your questions, your concerns about the project. So that is a small announcement. So this is a movement that we start today. Hashtag save the central vista, and we will be having some conversations around the history of central vista, around the plan, in the coming months. So don't forget to check that out. Have a great evening, and thank
Ishan,
you
can
so
I
much.
say something?
Sure, sir. Sure, sir.
You know, what you were just mentioning about the Central Vista project reminded me about a debate in Calcutta in 1949 and 1948, soon after independence, when the government announced that all these statues of British administrators and governors and former viceroys should be removed from public places in Calcutta. And Jadunath Sarkar was still alive then, and he wrote an article in Modern Review objecting to this. And really, that article is worth reading, because again, it raises questions which we should be debating about what should be our approach to the objects of history, the artifacts, and how should we preserve them, and how should change come about. It just struck me that it was quite an important debate in Calcutta at the time. And finally, Sarkar was asked by the chief minister to be a member of the committee which would decide on these statues. And he first refused, and finally agreed to be on the committee after a great deal of persuasion.
Yeah, so that's an interesting anecdote, and maybe we'll get to read that article maybe in some archives or something. And it is very important to save these collections, which are very important, which are invaluable for not just history students but public at large. So do join us in this movement. Use the hashtag save the central vista on Twitter, on Facebook, and share your memories, concerns, questions. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you.